The morning of November 20th, 1944, at the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht headquarters in Zossen, south of Berlin, Oberst Hans-Georg Eismann sat before a map table covered in coloured pins and handwritten reports. Each pin represented an American division identified on the Western Front. He had been counting them for 3 hours. The number made no sense. According to the intelligence estimates his department had prepared in 1941, the United States Army could field, at absolute maximum capacity, perhaps 4 million men under arms. This calculation had been based on sound reasoning. America's population stood at approximately 130 million. Its peacetime army numbered barely 190,000 men. Its National Guard, another 200,000. The Americans had demonstrated in the Great War that they could mobilize perhaps 4 million soldiers over several years, though that effort had nearly bankrupted their economy and relied heavily on Allied equipment and training. Eismann's pins told a different story. By November 1944, German intelligence had positively identified 61 American divisions in Europe alone. 61 divisions meant approximately 915,000 combat troops in the European theatre, not counting the enormous logistical tail required to support them. And intelligence reports from the Pacific indicated at least another 20 divisions fighting Japan. And there were more divisions training in the continental United States, preparing for deployment. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The mathematics troubled Eismann because they suggested something his training told him was impossible. The Americans appeared to have mobilized not 4 million men, but something closer to 12 million, possibly more. And they showed no signs of slowing down. Every month brought reports of new divisions, new corps, entire new armies appearing in the order of battle. Where were they coming from? How was an industrialized democracy producing soldiers faster than Germany, a militarized state that had spent a decade preparing for total war? The answer would prove devastating not just to German military planning, but to the entire conceptual framework through which the Wehrmacht understood modern warfare. Because the Americans had not mobilized 12 million men, by the time the war ended, they would field more than 16 million. And this number represented not the desperate final effort of a nation on the brink of collapse, but rather a deliberate, sustainable mobilization that the United States maintained while simultaneously outproducing the rest of the world, combined in tanks, aircraft, ships, and every other category of military hardware. To understand how Germany so catastrophically miscalculated American military potential requires returning to the period immediately before the war, when German intelligence began its assessments of likely adversaries. In the autumn of 1939, the Fremde Heere West, the German military intelligence department responsible for Western powers, prepared a comprehensive estimate of American military capacity. The report's authors worked from what they considered reliable precedent, American performance in the First World War. Between 1917 and 1918, the United States had mobilized approximately 4 million men, of whom roughly 2 million deployed to France. This effort had required 18 months and had strained American industry to its limits. American troops arrived in France equipped primarily with French and British weapons, wearing British-style helmets and relying entirely on Allied tanks and aircraft. The Fremde Heere West analysts noted several factors that would, in their assessment, limit American mobilization in any future conflict. First, American society remained deeply isolationist. The U.S. Congress had passed multiple neutrality acts throughout the 1930s, explicitly forbidding American involvement in foreign wars. Second, the American economy had barely recovered from the Great Depression. Unemployment remained high, industrial capacity sat underutilized, and the Roosevelt administration's primary focus remained domestic economic recovery. Third, the American military establishment remained tiny by European standards, with no tradition of mass conscription and no modern experience in mechanized warfare. Based on these factors, German intelligence concluded that the United States could, if absolutely forced into war and given several years to mobilize, perhaps field 4 to 5 million men. This estimate seemed generous, even optimistic. It assumed American industry could modernize rapidly, that American society would accept conscription, and that American military leadership could organize and train a mass army while simultaneously building the industrial base to equip it. What German intelligence failed to grasp was that every assumption underlying their estimate was about to prove catastrophically wrong. The first miscalculation concerned American industrial capacity. German analysts in 1939 looked at American automobile production figures and saw an economy optimized for consumer goods, not military hardware. They noted that American factories produced approximately 4 million passenger cars annually, far more than any European nation. But they interpreted this as a sign of industrial frivolity, not potential. A nation that devoted such enormous resources to building private automobiles for individual families clearly lacked the martial discipline necessary for total war. What they missed was the implication of that production capacity. If American industry could organize the production of 4 million complex machines annually for the civilian market, that same industry could be retooled for military production with relative ease. The stamping presses that formed automobile bodies could form tank hulls. The assembly lines that installed engines in cars could install engines in trucks, half-tracks, and armored vehicles. The supply chains that delivered components from hundreds of suppliers to final assembly plants could support military logistics on an unprecedented scale. Moreover, American industrial organization had developed techniques that European manufacturers had barely begun to adopt. The assembly line, pioneered by Henry Ford but refined by dozens of American companies throughout the 1920s and 30s, allowed for the rapid training of semi-skilled workers and the standardization of components across multiple manufacturing sites. An American factory worker needed weeks of training to perform specialized assembly tasks, where a European craftsman required years of apprenticeship. This meant American industry could expand production rapidly by hiring and training new workers, while European industry remained limited by the availability of skilled craftsmen. The second miscalculation concerned American geography and demographics. Germany, with a population of approximately 70 million in its 1937 borders, could theoretically mobilize perhaps 10 to 12 million men for military service, though doing so would cripple industrial production. The Wehrmacht had carefully calculated the balance between military manpower and industrial workforce, determining that roughly 8 million men under arms represented the sustainable maximum before industrial production began to collapse. American planners faced no such constraints. With a population nearly double Germany's and an industrial base that required far fewer skilled workers per unit of output, the United States could mobilize enormous armies while simultaneously expanding industrial production. The American agricultural sector, highly mechanized compared to European farming, could maintain food production with a reduced workforce. American women could enter factories in unprecedented numbers, a transition facilitated by the relatively unskilled nature of assembly line work. But perhaps the most significant miscalculation concerned American political will. German intelligence assumed that American isolationism, so powerful throughout the 1930s, would persist even after any declaration of war. They envisioned an American war effort similar to 1917 and 1918, reluctant, limited, focused primarily on material support for allies rather than direct military involvement. They assumed the American public would accept overseas deployment of perhaps 1 to 2 million men, but would resist the total mobilization that characterized European powers. This assumption rested on a fundamental misunderstanding of American political culture. American isolationism in the 1930s reflected not a lack of martial spirit, but rather a determination to avoid repeating what many Americans viewed as the mistakes of 1917 and 1918. Americans had mobilized for the Great War, suffered 60,000 combat deaths, and watched their European allies immediately resume territorial squabbles that suggested the entire effort had been futile. The lesson Americans drew was not that war was unacceptable, but that limited involvement in other nations' quarrels was unacceptable. If Americans were to fight, they would fight to win decisively, completely, and permanently. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, transformed American isolationism into its opposite virtually overnight. Within weeks, millions of American men were volunteering for military service. Congress authorized the selective service system to draft men between the ages of 18 and 45. American industry began conversion to military production on a scale that would have seemed impossible mere months earlier. German intelligence watched these developments with initial satisfaction. The American mobilization appeared chaotic, improvised, wasteful. New training camps sprouted across the United States, often little more than tent cities in muddy fields. Equipment remained scarce. New recruits drilled with wooden rifles and simulated tanks made from trucks with plywood armor. American military leadership seemed to change strategic direction weekly, unable to decide whether to prioritize the European or Pacific theater. What German analysts interpreted as chaos was actually the early stage of a mobilization system designed for unprecedented scale and speed. The Americans were not trying to build a perfect army from the beginning. They were building a system that could expand continuously, absorbing new recruits, training them rapidly, equipping them from an industrial base that grew exponentially, and deploying them to multiple theaters simultaneously. By the end of 1942, German intelligence estimates began showing strain. The number of American divisions in training exceeded initial projections. Industrial production figures filtering through neutral countries suggested American factories were producing far more than German analysts had thought possible, but the Wehrmacht High Command remained confident. Training divisions in the United States was one thing. Deploying them across the Atlantic to fight in Europe was quite another. The U-boat campaign would exact such heavy losses on transatlantic convoys that American reinforcement would slow to a trickle, regardless of how many men the Americans trained. This confidence lasted until the spring of 1943, when German naval intelligence began reporting that American merchant ship construction had exceeded all projections. The United States was building cargo ships faster than U-boats could sink them, and the rate of construction was accelerating. American shipyards had standardized the Liberty ship design, a simple, relatively crude freighter that could be built in less than 2 months using prefabricated components and largely unskilled labor. By the end of 1943, American shipyards were launching 3 Liberty ships per day. 3 ships per day meant the Americans were adding more cargo capacity each month than the entire German merchant fleet possessed. The implications cascaded through German strategic planning. If the Americans could transport unlimited quantities of men and material across the Atlantic, then the size of their army became limited only by their ability to mobilize and train soldiers. And by mid-1943, it was becoming clear that American mobilization was proceeding far faster than anyone in German intelligence had imagined possible. Oberst Eismann, studying his map in November 1944, represented the culmination of this realization. He had joined the Fremde Heere West in 1941, fresh from service in France, confident in German military superiority and dismissive of American military potential. 3 years later, he spent his days trying to track American divisions that appeared to materialize from nowhere, equipped with standardized weapons and vehicles in quantities that suggested American industry had solved some fundamental problem of mass production that continued to elude German planners. The reports on Eismann's desk told a story that violated everything he had learned about military mobilization. American divisions were arriving in Europe fully equipped, with all organic transport, artillery, and support units at full strength. Each division brought with it enough supplies for sustained operations, often including spare parts, replacement vehicles, and reserve ammunition stocks that German units could only dream of possessing. And when these divisions entered combat and suffered casualties, they received rapid replacement of both men and equipment, allowing them to maintain combat effectiveness far longer than comparable German units. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. What disturbed Eismann most was not the quantity of American forces, staggering though that was, but rather the quality of their logistics. German armies in 1944 struggled constantly with fuel shortages, ammunition shortages, spare parts shortages. German divisions often went into battle at 60 or 70% of authorized strength, missing entire battalions, with their remaining vehicles cannibalized for parts to keep a smaller number running. American divisions, by contrast, appeared to operate at or above authorized strength, with supplies flowing so abundantly that frontline troops sometimes discarded usable equipment simply because newer models arrived. The psychological impact of this disparity extended far beyond headquarters analysts like Eastman. German soldiers returning from the Western Front told stories that sounded like propaganda, except they were demonstrably true. Stories of American field kitchens serving hot meals within hours of taking a position. Of American medics with so much plasma and morphine that they treated German wounded as readily as American. Of American supply dumps stretching for miles, containing more rations than an entire German division would receive in a month. These stories circulated through the Wehrmacht with corrosive effect because they revealed a truth that German propaganda had spent years denying. The Americans had built a military machine that operated according to fundamentally different principles than European armies. European military tradition emphasized élan, fighting spirit, tactical sophistication, the superior morale of disciplined soldiers. American military practice emphasized logistics, standardization, overwhelming material superiority. A German soldier might be individually better trained, more experienced, more tactically flexible than his American counterpart. None of that mattered when the American could call on unlimited artillery support, rely on rapid replacement of casualties, and knew that his supply line extended unbroken back to factories in Detroit that could replace his entire division's equipment in weeks. By December 1944, German intelligence estimates had been revised upward repeatedly, each revision bringing them closer to the terrifying reality. The Americans had not mobilized 4 million men. They had mobilized 12 million, 14 million, and the number kept growing. And unlike Germany, which had reached the absolute limit of its mobilization potential by 1943, the United States showed every sign of being able to sustain and even expand its military establishment indefinitely. The Battle of the Bulge, launched in December 1944 as Germany's final offensive in the West, revealed the full extent of the disparity. German planners had concentrated virtually every available reserve division, scraped together fuel and ammunition for what they knew would be a single massive blow, and achieved complete tactical surprise. For 48 hours, the German offensive drove deep into American lines, capturing thousands of prisoners and threatening to split the Allied front. Then, American logistics responded. Within days, American commanders had redirected entire corps, moving hundreds of thousands of men and thousands of vehicles to contain the German breakthrough. Supplies flowed to the front in quantities that left German observers stunned. American artillery batteries fired thousands of rounds per day, every day, while German artillery struggled to preserve dwindling ammunition stocks. American tank units replaced losses, overnight, while German panzer divisions cannibalized disabled vehicles to keep a handful of tanks running. Within 2 weeks, the German offensive had been contained, then reversed. American units that had been scattered and surrounded reformed, resupplied, and counterattacked with a speed that German commanders found incomprehensible. By the end of January 1945, the Battle of the Bulge had cost Germany approximately 100,000 casualties and virtually all of its remaining armor reserves in the West. American losses had been comparable in numbers, but the Americans replaced them within weeks. Germany could not. It was during the Bulge that German intelligence officers began interrogating American prisoners in numbers large enough to understand the full scope of American mobilization. The prisoners came from dozens of different divisions, representing units from across the United States, small-town farm boys from Iowa, factory workers from Detroit, college, students from California. Each prisoner, when questioned about his unit's history, told a similar story. Months of stateside training, ample equipment, abundant food, transport across the Atlantic on massive convoys that faced minimal submarine threat, arrival in Britain at camps stocked with supplies, then deployment to France through ports that handled thousands of tons of cargo daily. The interrogation reports accumulated on Eisman's desk through January and February of 1945 painted a picture of an American war machine that operated at a scale German planners had not imagined possible. One report noted that a single American division captured near Bastogne had brought with it more trucks than an entire German corps possessed. Another detailed the rations carried by American infantry companies. Not just the basic field rations German soldiers received when supplies were good, but supplementary items like chocolate, cigarettes, coffee, and chewing gum issued as standard. A third report analyzed the equipment of a captured American quartermaster unit and calculated that this single support battalion carried more spare parts inventory than the entire German Ninth Army possessed. But the most devastating intelligence came not from interrogations but from captured American documents. In late January 1945, German forces overran a temporary American headquarters during a local counterattack and captured several boxes of administrative files before being forced to retreat. Among these files were strength reports, unit rosters, and replacement schedules that revealed the internal workings of American personnel management. The documents showed that American divisions in Europe were receiving individual replacements at a rate that allowed them to maintain near full strength despite continuous combat. Each week, thousands of replacement soldiers arrived from the United States, were processed through replacement depots in Britain and France, then assigned to units at the front. The system was not perfect. Combat veterans often complained about the quality of replacements who arrived with minimal training, but it was functional at a scale that had no German equivalent. More importantly, the documents revealed the existence of dozens of American divisions still in the United States, either in training or preparing for deployment. The casualty replacement rate suggested that the United States was producing trained soldiers faster than the European theatre could absorb them, even with casualty rates running at tens of thousands per month. Eisman compiled a report in February 1945, estimating total American mobilization at 14 million men under arms, with the potential to expand further if the war continued. The report noted that this figure exceeded by a factor of 3 the maximum mobilization German intelligence had considered possible in 1941. More disturbingly, the report concluded that American mobilization appeared sustainable indefinitely. Unlike Germany, which had stripped its economy to feed the military and was now facing collapse as combat losses exceeded replacement capacity, the United States appeared to have achieved a balance where military expansion and industrial expansion reinforced each other. The mechanism behind this achievement became clearer as German intelligence analyzed American industrial production figures. Between 1941 and 1945, American industrial output had more than doubled. This expansion had been achieved not by stripping the civilian economy, but by building entirely new production capacity. The United States had constructed thousands of new factories, employed millions of additional workers, and standardized production methods to a degree that allowed rapid scaling. The key to American success lay in several interconnected factors that German planners had systematically underestimated. First, American industry had begun tooling for military production in 1940 and 1941, well before Pearl Harbor, giving the United States a crucial head start. Second, American manufacturers had embraced standardization and interchangeable parts to a degree that European manufacturers, with their emphasis on craft production, found difficult to match. A single American vehicle component might be manufactured at a dozen different factories, all producing identical parts that could be installed in vehicles, assembled at entirely different locations. Third, American industrial planning had solved the problem of skilled labor shortages by designing production processes that required minimal skill. A Detroit factory worker assembling aircraft engines in 1944 might have been a housewife with no industrial experience in 1941. After 6 weeks of training, she could perform her specialized assembly task as reliably as a German craftsman with years of apprenticeship. This meant American industry could expand its workforce almost without limit, drawing on populations that European industry had never seriously considered employing in skilled manufacturing. Fourth, and perhaps most importantly, American agriculture had achieved productivity levels that freed enormous numbers of workers for military service and industrial production. American farms in 1944 produced more food with fewer workers than in 1941, thanks to mechanization, improved seeds, and intensive use of fertilizers and pesticides. A single American farmer could feed dozens of people, where a European farmer typically produced only modest surpluses beyond his own family's needs. This meant the United States could mobilize 16 million military personnel and millions of additional industrial workers, while simultaneously increasing food production and even exporting food to allies. By March 1945, as American and British forces crossed the Rhine and Soviet armies closed on Berlin from the east, the true scale of American mobilization had become undeniable to even the most optimistic German commanders. The Americans had not fielded 4 million men. They had fielded more than 12 million in the European and Mediterranean theaters alone, with another 4 million fighting Japan in the Pacific, and hundreds of thousands more in training, in transit, or providing support services worldwide. The final figure, compiled after the war's end, showed that the United States had mobilized more than 16 million men and women for military service between 1941 and 1945. Of these, more than 11 million served in the Army, over 4 million in the Navy, nearly 700,000 in the Marines, and several 100,000 in the Coast Guard. At peak strength in 1945, the American military represented the largest organized force in human history, exceeding in both absolute numbers and logistical capability any previous military establishment. But raw numbers told only part of the story. What distinguished American mobilization was not simply its scale, but its sustainability. Germany had mobilized approximately 13 million men during the war, but this mobilization had been achieved by stripping the civilian economy to the point of collapse. By 1945, German industrial production was falling, German cities were starving, and the German railway system was disintegrating. The Wehrmacht might still field millions of soldiers, but those soldiers increasingly lacked weapons, ammunition, fuel, and food. The American military establishment in 1945, by contrast, represented only a fraction of total American economic output. American factories produced military equipment while simultaneously maintaining civilian production at levels that ensured American citizens experienced virtually no material privation during the war. American soldiers overseas received rations that included meat, fresh vegetables, and luxury items, while American civilians at home faced only minor rationing of items like sugar, coffee, and gasoline. American war production had been achieved not by consuming the seed corn of future prosperity, but by expanding total production to unprecedented levels. The psychological impact of this realization on German military leadership cannot be overstated. For professional German officers, raised in a tradition that emphasized tactical excellence, operational brilliance, and the superior fighting qualities of disciplined soldiers, the American approach to warfare represented a fundamental challenge. The Americans had proven that industrial capacity, applied systematically to military logistics, could overcome tactical skill, operational experience, and fighting spirit. A mediocre American division with unlimited supplies could outlast an elite German division fighting on empty stomachs, with ammunition counted in rounds rather than tons. Eisman survived the war and was interrogated by American intelligence officers in June 1945. In those interviews, preserved in the U.S. National Archives, he attempted to explain how German intelligence had so completely misjudged American military potential. His explanation centered on a failure of imagination. German planners had assumed that American mobilization would follow European patterns, limited by the same constraints that limited European powers. They had failed to grasp that American industry operated according to different principles, that American society possessed reserves of untapped productivity that could be mobilized rapidly, and that American political culture, once committed to total war, would accept mobilization on a scale that European nations could achieve only through decades of militarization. But there was also, Eisman admitted, an element of wishful thinking. German strategy for defeating the Western Allies had always depended on the assumption that American involvement would be limited, that American public opinion would not sustain the casualties necessary for victory, that American industry could not produce both military equipment and consumer goods simultaneously. Each of these assumptions had been proven false, but acknowledging that fact required accepting that Germany had entered a war it could not possibly win, a conclusion too psychologically devastating to embrace until defeat had become undeniable. The contrast between German expectations and American reality extended to every aspect of military operations. German planners had assumed that American soldiers, drawn primarily from a civilian population with no military tradition, would lack the discipline and fighting qualities of professional European soldiers. In practice, American soldiers proved adequate to their task not because they matched German soldiers in individual skill, but because they operated within a system that compensated for individual shortcomings through overwhelming material support. A German infantry company in 1945 might possess superior marksmanship, better small unit tactics, and more experienced leaders than its American equivalent. But the American company could call on artillery support that delivered thousands of shells within minutes, air support that arrived reliably when requested, and resupply that ensured soldiers never went hungry or lacked ammunition. The individual German soldier might be better, but the American military system was incomparably superior, and in modern industrial warfare, systems mattered more than individual excellence. This lesson, learned at such terrible cost by the Wehrmacht, would reshape military thinking for generations. The American way of war, emphasizing logistics, standardization, and overwhelming material superiority, became the model that other nations sought to emulate. The Soviet Union, despite its very different political system, adopted many American production techniques and logistical methods. Even nations that could not hope to match American industrial capacity recognized that modern warfare required industrial mobilization on a scale that made traditional distinctions between military and civilian economies increasingly meaningless. The 16 million Americans who served during World War II represented not just a quantitative achievement, but a qualitative transformation in how democracies could organize for total war. The United States had proven that a free society, with minimal militarization during peacetime, could mobilize faster and more completely than totalitarian states that had spent years preparing for conflict. This achievement rested on industrial capacity, but also on social structures that allowed rapid adaptation, educational systems that produced trainable recruits, and political institutions that could coordinate massive national efforts while maintaining democratic governance. For Germany, the realization came too late. By the time German intelligence had revised its estimates to approximate reality, the war had already been lost. The 4 million American soldiers German planners had expected to face at maximum had become 16 million, and those 16 million were backed by an industrial establishment that produced more military equipment in 1944 alone than Germany had produced during the entire war. The mathematics of attrition, which German strategy had always relied upon, had been inverted. Germany could not kill Americans faster than America could replace them, could not destroy American equipment faster than American factories could build new equipment, could not sustain casualties at the rate the Americans could inflict them. In the ruins of Berlin in May 1945, as American and Soviet soldiers met at the Elbe River and German resistance collapsed, the final accounting became clear. Germany had mobilized its entire society for total war and had been overwhelmed by an opponent that had treated the war as one important task among many. The Americans had mobilized 16 million soldiers, while simultaneously increasing civilian prosperity, had produced unprecedented quantities of military equipment while maintaining consumer goods production, and had sustained this effort across 2 oceans and multiple theaters of war with apparent ease. The lesson was not lost on those who studied the war's outcome. Military strength in the modern era would depend not on peacetime militarization or warrior traditions, but on industrial capacity, organizational efficiency, and the ability to mobilize society's full productive potential rapidly and sustainably. The Americans had demonstrated that democracy, far from being a weakness in total war, could be a decisive advantage when combined with industrial capacity and social structures that rewarded innovation and efficiency. Eismann spent his final years writing military history, attempting to explain to new generations of German officers how their predecessors had so completely misjudged American capabilities. His conclusion, written in 1959, struck a note of professional admiration mixed with bitter recognition of strategic failure. We expected Americans to fight like Europeans, constrained by the same limitations that constrained us. We failed to understand that American war-making rested on fundamentally different foundations. By the time we recognized our error, we faced not 4 million American soldiers, as we had estimated possible, but 16 million. And those 16 million had behind them an industrial capacity we could not match, supplied by a logistical system we could not disrupt, supported by a society we had catastrophically underestimated. We lost the war in our planning offices, years before the first battle, when we convinced ourselves that American mobilization would mirror European experience. It did not, and that fact alone sealed our defeat. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.